Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Cantor. You may be seated. I now have the pleasure of introducing our wonderful speaker for this evening. Ambassador Rabbi David Saperstein was designated by Newsweek magazine as the most influential rabbi in America and by the Washington Post as the quintessential religious lobbyist on Capitol Hill. And for 40 years, Rabbi Saperstein served as the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, otherwise known as the RAC. Rabbi Saperstein represented the Reform Jewish movement, the largest segment of American Jewry, to Congress and the administration. He continues as a senior advisor for policy and strategy for the RAC and the Union for Reform Judaism. Under Rabbi Saperstein, writes J.J. Goldberg in his book Jewish Power, the Religious Action Center has become one of the most powerful Jewish bodies in Washington, second only to AIPAC. And during the second term of President Obama's administration, Rabbi Saperstein served as the United States Ambassador for International Religious Freedom, carrying out his responsibilities as the country's chief diplomat on religious freedom issues, the first rabbi in American history to have served as an ambassador. And Rabbi Saperstein has also served on 2 federal advisory boards and as the first chair of the congressionally created U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom in 2019 through 20. He served as the president of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, the international arm of Reform Judaism. And one of the many moments, by the way, that confirmed my desire to become a rabbi was hearing Rabbi Saperstein speak at a URJ biennial just a few years ago. It was really remarkable to hear someone speak with a prophetic voice. And when we talk about prophetic voice, we don't talk about somebody predicting a future, but we talk about someone being not a foreteller, we talk about somebody being a forthteller, being able to use their voice and their will to push society where it needed to be. It was truly inspiring. And when he was invited to be the speaker at my ordination, he continued to inspire me and my classmates as we set out on our careers and our rabbinates. He continues to inspire me and so many others in his rabbinate, and it is truly an honor to have you here with us. Arriving here straight from your speaking engagement in Abu Dhabi. Not only are you truly an outstanding rabbinic force within our movement, you're a mensch, and we thank you for all that you continue to do for our movement and our people. Let us welcome now Rabbi Saperstein.
Rabbis, of you, Cantor, thank you. Thank you for leading a wonderful service, and thank you for your leadership of this congregation, and I'm really pleased to be back here. It's been quite a while. My colleague Ron Shapiro is a contemporary, and we shared numerous occasions over the years of working together. So to be here with Rabbi Cherkov, and I really appreciate your remembering those occasions when our lives have intersected, and I know that this will be the first of many times. Deeply appreciative of the fact that this congregation has always had its own strong social justice program, including some of our efforts in Every Voice and Every Vote, our efforts of our synagogues across America over the last several elections to help get out the vote, get people registered to vote. I'm extraordinarily proud. We're up in the hundreds of thousands of voter contacts that in each election the Reformed Jewish Congregations of America make in getting people registered, which of course this year in many states was much more challenging, how to be registered, how to actually find the polls where you could vote, how to overcome some of the technical requirements that have been added to voters in the last several elections. And I'm particularly proud that we really have made a significant contribution to strengthening American democracy. So where to begin? It's a Shabbat service. I have to walk a delicate tightrope in terms of issues of partisanship. Please notice I chose a red tie to wear this evening. Let me begin just with some trivia about the election. There will be at least 6, and it looks like only 6, new members, Jewish members of Congress. We've gone up and down in terms of the numbers of the House. It's actually fallen over the last several elections. This will be a significant increase, 6 new members. It looked like Adam Frisch might edge out Lauren Boebert from Colorado, one of the more far-right members of the Congress. That doesn't look like it will happen at this point. It's mathematically still possible, but very unlikely at this point. 2 of the new Jewish members are Republicans, Max Miller from Ohio and George Santos from New York. Santos is also the first openly LGBTQ non-incumbent Republican ever elected to Congress. We've seen an ebb and flow in terms of the Republican caucus of the House and Senate on the issues of gay rights over the last years. Periods of more expansive effort, joining in more expansive efforts for protection of gay rights, and then some more restrictive efforts as well. But I hope that George Santos' presence will add to that. We're seeing the first Gen Z member of the United States Congress. That is anyone who was born in 1996 or later. And this is an exciting development to see the next generation, Maxwell Alejandro Frost, a 25-year-old Democrat who's going to represent the 10th District, Congressional District in Florida. That's the Orlando area here. He's also the first Afro-Cuban member of Congress, and Congress has slowly but steadily become more diverse over the years. Vermont has elected Becca Balint to its at-large House seat, which is a milestone because Vermont had remained the only state in the United States that had never sent a woman to Congress. And she's also Jewish and openly gay. Markwine Mullen will be the first Native American senator from Oklahoma in the past 100 years. We have 2 lesbian governors now. So the issue of diversity in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity continues to increase in America, even when efforts to make laws more restrictive is a continuing battle that we're having here. And then, and I turn to you to explain the significance of this, I would point out to you the strange anomaly that now, after John Fetterman takes his sworn in, fully 10%, 10 of the 100 senators are named John. Think about it. Together, could we name all 10? I'm not sure here, but it is because we have, let's see, Wyoming, North Dakota senators that we sometimes don't keep in the front of our minds on that list. Here, I'm not exactly sure what the significance is, but I will point out that it's the same number of Jewish senators. You know, that we have, again, we've been just around this mark for the last 20 years, but we again have a minion in the United States Senate. Yes, a reform minion, to be sure. Dianne Feinstein's father was Jewish. I think Michael Bennett's also was Jewish, but a minion nonetheless in the United States Senate. And this little trivia above all. Democracy worked. Whatever you may think of the outcome of this election, many of us feared that this would be, in ways beyond what has happened, an angrier, more divisive, perhaps more violent election. courts upholding the right of poll watchers to carry guns with them in some states in America, with those of minority communities feeling echoes of the Ku Klux Klan era. The anger of so much of our discourse these days. This is a frightening time after January 6th. And yet, it was a peaceful election. A lot of the horror stories on both sides just really didn't happen. This was something remarkable about the resiliency of American democracy. But we are, as this election points out again, a terribly divided country. Divided in so many ways. And it's Veterans Day. I mean, think about how divided our country has been over most of the wars that we fought. The Revolutionary War, with Tories and American patriots fighting each other. The Civil War, the most divisive moment in American history. The political battles that often broke out into violence over the existence of slavery in America. Questions of whether we ought to go into World War I and arguments in America about the Red Scare at that time. The intense debates of whether we should get involved in World War II before Pearl Harbor happened, with many of the most outspokenly anti-Semitic voices, Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, and others calling for America first, and the isolationists. Indeed, right just a year before the war, Ford went to receive the highest civilian award that Germany was able to give, given to him directly by Adolf Hitler. We've had our arguments over the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War with intense protests on both sides and often violence being evoked by this. But I think almost everyone believed that this moment was a perilous moment in terms of democracy, that the effort to deny the election results to a rightfully elected president on January 6th represented a line that was crossed that was almost unprecedented in American history. And the truth is that both sides can claim credit or justification for their position on many of the issues that divide America. For Democrats, the accusation that on abortion, on democracy, on climate change, the Republican Party is missing issues of the most fundamental rights and fundamental challenges to America, and on the issues of crime and immigration and the disproportionate impact on immigration on some states rather than being dispersed across the country as a whole, and inflation and the terrible impact that inflation was having. The Democratic Party was just indifferent to very real challenges that really affect America. And if you look at the results of the election, they were both right. Really interesting. I don't know how many people caught today. It was something that an argument I've been making, but not nearly as keenly as I heard it today on the Daily, the podcast of the New York Times, in their interview that they've done over the last several elections with Nate Cohn. And he pointed out that in almost every state where in this election, not things that had happened before, in this election, an abortion issue was a contentious issue in this election, resolution to ban abortion, things like that. Or democracy was felt to be imperiled because, take the governor race with Josh Shapiro and Doug Mastriani in Pennsylvania, here, where there were election deniers and people really carrying significant messages that would challenge whether democracy should continue to exist the way it was going, where those kinds of issues were at stake, almost in every case, the Democrats prevailed. And where they weren't at stake, then the issues like inflation and crime and immigration actually did result in this normal midterm rejection of the presidency, whoever the incumbent president is, taking place, would happen in that state. So you take Pennsylvania and New York, didn't exist in New York, and wherever there were contentious, competitive House votes in New York, the Republicans won. In Pennsylvania, in almost every case, the Democrats ran. In Virginia, where you didn't have these issues in this particular election, the Republicans did well. In Michigan, which is a very divided state, overwhelmingly the Democrats did particularly well. The governor was reelected, and many of the competitive races, the Democrats won. Both sides are going to claim some justification for the arguments that they've been making. Would it not be logical for us to recognize that there's legitimacy on all of these issues, and that America would be in a much stronger position if we could work together? And I need to set the context for this election in terms of just a little bit of history, in terms of bipartisanship in this country in the last 100 years, and in terms of divisions of the Jewish community. So just a quick journey in the last 100 years. If you look back in the 20th century, it is hard to think of a single major achievement for what I think Republicans or Democrats would call social justice that did not happen because of a bipartisan coalition of decency on Capitol Hill and multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, bipartisan or nonpartisan coalitions of decency in communities across America. The labor movement, the civil rights movement. We wouldn't have had the civil rights bills. You know, we're very proud in the reform movement that our civil rights community's contributions to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 were drafted in the conference room of the Reform Movement Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C., that I was honored to run for so long. And my tenure goes back to where the key figures who a decade earlier, before I came, had actually helped write those bills. The Clarence Mitchells and Joe Rouse and Roy Wilkins and Arnie Aronsons, that they were all there and still active when I first came to Washington. We're very proud of that. But it wouldn't have passed if it weren't for the Jacob Javits and the Dirksons and so many Republican senators who stood up to say that civil rights represented American values. And this country will be better for ensuring that no one is discriminated against because of race, because of age, because of religion, because of national origin. And indeed, with all the problems we still have, and they are enormous, there are probably 250 million women and minorities in this country who enjoy rights and opportunities, with all the discrimination they still face, rights and opportunities that their grandparents could only have dreamed of. The paradox of America. And you can go down the list of everything else, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the environmental movement here, with almost every bill supported by large numbers of Republicans and Democrats, all of the economic justice programs that we have enjoying significant support in a bipartisan basis, the support for Israel, the support for the Soviet Jewry movement. Go down the list of the great achievements of the 20th century, all because of a bipartisan coalition of decency. One of the impacts of political strategies today is that the belief that our party will do better if we stop the other party from gaining anything, if they control the White House or they control Congress, then we will, working together and both claiming credit for it. And time and again on major issues, stalemates happen. A lot bipartisan activity does go on in Congress. It doesn't look that way, but it actually happens on a lot of pieces of legislation. But on the big ones, too often we find ourselves crippled and more divided. That positions that never were partisan issues today are partisan issues. Take the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As I said, strong support in both parties. Wouldn't have happened without it. And it was reauthorized in the 1980s. Almost unanimous. It was reauthorized again for another 25 years. In 2006, the vote, 98-0 in the Senate of the United States. There were about a dozen objectors in the 435 members of the House of Representatives. 2006. Today, not because they don't care about civil rights, but simply because of the way our political system has moved. On the Senate of the United States, you would hardly get a single Republican vote. And issues that weren't partisan today are partisan. And conversely, when Republicans say dealing with crime is a serious issue, dealing with equitable kind of the question of how we actually deal with immigration is really a serious issue, Democrats too often say, we'll deal with it some other time. That's not the real issue. And what's behind it is your racism and your attitude towards people who come from different countries, or people who look different, or your overt racism is really behind your objections, your calling for us to deal with crime or immigration. We have to find ways to hear each other and listen to each other better than we've done. You know, I'm going to give you the polling data on the Jewish community in a few minutes. But over the last century, again, pretty much in national elections, always been different in local elections and sometimes even state elections, but in national elections for senators, congresspersons, and presidents, 2/3 to 3/4 of the Jewish community has voted Democratic. It's always been that way. Always been that way. You know the last time, anyone know the last time that a plurality of American Jews voted for a Republican president? Anyone want to take a guess of who was the last? Ronald Reagan is a very good guess here because he got the next largest to the actual last time someone got a plurality. So he didn't get it. And why did he do so well in comparison to Jimmy Carter? Anyone remember what was going on in 1980? Because John Anderson was running and pulled away a number of votes, more from Carter probably than from Reagan. So what, anyone want to take another guess who it was? Stevenson, you mean Eisenhower? No, Eisenhower did do better than let's say those who ran against Franklin Delano Roosevelt had done. So it was a change in this. No, the last time was Warren G. Harding in 1920. And since then, it is, and sometimes even larger. It was larger in a number of in several of the elections with above 3/4 for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And it was for Clinton, it was for Al Gore, and it was for the first Obama election, and Obama fell down to more normal levels of support in the second one. So what does that mean? It means there were always 35% of the Jewish community who were Republicans. You wouldn't believe that if you think about the way the organized Jewish community speaks. And for those of you who are liberals and Democrats, just imagine if it were the opposite, how you'd feel. If 2/3 of the members of our congregations were conservative or were Republicans and speaking out, and you felt, wait a minute, that's not who I am. Again, we need to be open to people and recognize that people have different viewpoints. And neither Republicans or Democrats or conservatives or liberals have a lock on authentic Jewish moral positions on these issues. You can argue that there are conservative issues that are profoundly resonate with the Jewish tradition, and liberal issues that profoundly resonate with the Jewish position. Our movement has generally taken the liberal stance, seeing in Judaism its concern for the poor, its concern for the stranger, its concern for the protection of God's creation. Go down the list of that. It resonates more deeply with liberal issues, to which most Jewish Republicans I know would answer, I care about those things as much as you do. I think the way you're going about it is wrong. And listening to each other is crucially important in dealing with these issues. In the 1970s, something changed in the Jewish community. Something changed. Commentary magazine became an intellectual powerhouse for conservative ideas and what we call neoconservative ideas in America. And it energized people who were conservative and Republicans in the Jewish community. We saw organizations form about it, the Republican Jewish Coalition here, and then other magazines like Midstream joined the ranks of such efforts, and the Jewish Policy Center, and Toward Tradition, and all kinds of organizations organizing Jews on the right to speak out. And they became more assertive and pushed back against the liberal tendencies. What's interesting is that our views haven't changed. Our views haven't changed. Or if they have on one or two issues over the last 60 years. Capital punishment a little bit, some of the economic issues a bit. But in the main, we remain one of, if not actually, of the different kinds of religious and ethnic groups measured by pollsters, we remain the second best educated or the first best educated, the second wealthiest, and the second most liberal community in America. Have any idea, actually, who would be number one on anything that we're not one, but number two on? Southeast Asians. And mostly Southeast Asian Hindus tend to be particularly liberal, according to the Pew Research Center. So we remain as liberal as ever. Our views haven't changed, but the voices you hear, our Jewish voices, are much louder now and assertive and empowered on the conservative side. But the numbers in this election remain about the same as they have always been. Just a couple of other contextual issues here. One is about how changed America is from what it used to be, and how quickly it is changing. If you go all the way back to 2008, 56% of Americans identified, and listen carefully, identified as white Christians. That is, they were identified as white, and they identified as Christians. There were many Christians who were not white, African American community, Latino community. All right, and there are many whites who are not Christian, who are either secular or belong to some other religion, one or another of the other religions. But of those who identify as white Christians, which is what we think historically of America, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant domination of American politics and money in this country for so long, and then the growth of the Catholic community as well, white Christians is what marked America. Between 2008 and 2019, 11 years later, that 56% had fallen to 44%. A stunning drop. Part of that has to do with the secularization of America. just a growing number of people that don't identify with any religion, but a lot of that has to do with the shrinking of the mainline Protestant denominations in this country. Of all the theologically liberal denominations in America, of the mainline Protestants, they've all shrunk in the last 60 years, from 1960 until today, 62 years. They've all declined by 25 to 60%. Only the Reformed Jewish movement has grown by leaps and bounds. It has grown by leaps and bounds of enormous dimensions, according to the polling data that exists. When many of us were kids, the conservative movement was the largest denomination in Jewish life. Today, the Reformed Jewish movement is larger than Orthodox Jews, conservative Jews, and Reconstructionist Jews combined. In the Big Pew poll of 2013, we were 1% larger than all the other streams of Judaism combined. 7 years later, in the 2020 poll, we were 7 points larger than all the other streams combined. And why? First, because Alex Schindler opened up our congregations to intermarried families. Secondly, that Alex Schindler opened up our congregations to LGBTQ members and families in our communities. Third, because Alex Schindler defined the Jew no longer only by a maternal definition of being a child of a Jewish mother, but also paternal criteria would suffice. He said, if we're going to be say that women are entitled to equal rights to men, then the opposite should be true as well. If that's a Jewish value, then it works both ways in this idea of the historic Jewish definition of a child of a Jewish mother. And because we were pretty much the only denomination that never drew back from our strong social justice identity. And the polls tell us that if you ask the question, what is the most common way you express your identity, that number 1 or 2 will always be involvement in social justice work, identifying with social idealism, far more than Jewish ritual, far more than support for Israel, etc. If you ask the question, what is important to you, then things like Israel will jump up to the top. But if they got to choose one or the other, social justice remains just about the highest. Pew, in its polls, put another choice that people can make into the poll that no one had asked before, and that is remembering the Holocaust, and that is far and away the most important one. But so, in terms of the Reformed Jews, and in terms of the Jewish community, the voting patterns this time were pretty much what they have been here, and have remained. In this election, according to the one major poll that's been released so far, we will likely have other polls soon. 74% of the Jewish community voted for Democrats in this election. Biden has an approval rating of 67% in the Jewish community. That's been true for polls over his entire tenure as president, and you know what it is in the general population and how different it is. President Trump has a 79% disapproval rating. By the way, the poll asked it, Bibi Netanyahu has a 59% unfavorable rating as well. 69% still on Israel issues, remains committed to the two-state solution. 24% believe that Israel ought to annex the West Bank and ought to be able to put settlements anywhere. 37% say that Israel should suspend any settlements from being built. 39% say they can build settlements, but only where the blocks of settlements are now. So you see the dispersion there, but this is the Jewish community as a whole, tends to remain dovish, committed to the two-state solution, and 70% wants to return to the JCPOA, the agreement with Iran on nuclear arms. I would point out in 2014, that was 84%, and it's dropped to 71%. So it's declining, but still a substantial number of Jews feel that way. The Reformed Jewish movement, 84% voted Democratic, as opposed to the 74% of the Jewish community here. But what about other segments of the community? This has been true now, what I'm about to say, for now a couple of, about 40 years now, and that is the role of evangelicals in American politics. White evangelicals, 83% voted for Republicans in this election. 83%. If you take out evangelicals, the 70, 80 million evangelicals in the country, then 59%, nearly 60% of the American public voted for Democrats. The other way that we know about religious behavior is to ask the question, how often do you go to worship? And for those who go to worship once a week or more, 66% of them, 66%. And then if they go once a week, it drops to 52%. And if they don't go at all, it drops to 31%. All right? And in terms of who votes for Democrats, it's the exact opposite of that. If you don't go to, don't go to worship at all, 66%, the same number. And it has been almost identical in polling data for nearly 30 years of this. It is one of the major predictor of how people vote. One of the interesting things that Pew did this year was dig deep into, is being evangelical leading to conservative causes? Or does being conservative and a Christian lead you to be evangelical? And they found, somewhat surprising, because I think many of us who have been critical of the so-called religious right or moral majority over the last decades, believe that the evangelicism led to conservative thinking. Turns out that it is more common that people become evangelical when they become assertively conservative within Protestant, or sometimes from Catholicism to Protestantism. They find their ways to evangelical expressions of religion. Just another example of the way that there's an intersection between religion. We've seen the rise of Christian nationalism in this election that is particularly dangerous at this particular moment in our history, of really arguing America was intended to be a Christian country, intended by God to be a Christian country. This is picking up not on the framers of our fundamental documents, the deists, often deist framers of our fundamental documents, who believe separation of church and state was good for a government and good for religion, but rather the Puritan idea. I mean, think about the narrative myth of the Puritans. They fled persecution and oppression in Europe. They crossed a wilderness on their way to a promised land, a watery wilderness. In the middle of the wilderness, they entered into a covenant with God, not at Sinai, but the Mayflower Compact. They land on the promised land to create God's kingdom here. And if you look at the laws of the courts of New England of 1649 or 1650, the laws of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, everyone has a biblical citation next to it. And that was seen in the Great Awakening in the mid-1700s that scattered the landscape with small churches, and the Great Awakening of the middle of the 1800s that developed the denominational structure we want, and in its extreme expression led to the Know Nothing Party, which has many similarities with some of it was anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic, anti-Black party of the mid-1800s. And then we had the rise of the religious right in the later part of the 1900s as well, and the Christian nationalism of today that has merged the so-called replacement ideology that Jews are, for many of the people of these extreme right groups that we've learned a lot about because of January 6th, the secular and the religious ones, blacks, immigrants are symptoms of everything wrong with America. But as the people who study this well says, their anti-Semitism is the real driving force at the heart of many of these groups. They go here, so those groups may be the symptoms of what's wrong in America. We're the cause. This is all part of our plan, our conspiracy. In this election, we heard voices that were anti-Semitic voices. We heard voices that were racist voices in our politics. It used to be in American politics, you couldn't make it in mainstream society, giving voice to any of those ideas. I remember when I first took over the RAC, one of the first things I did was invite all of the 9 Democratic candidates in the primaries of 1976 to meet with Jewish leadership. First time Jimmy Carter ever met with national Jewish leaders. To our surprise, George Wallace agreed to come. We weren't accessible. We carried him up in his wheelchair at that time. Here he came into the room and he said, I want to begin by apologizing for some of the things over the years I've said about Jews and I've said about blacks, Negroes, he was his words. You know, whether you believed him or not, here, it was a symbol of how there were limits to what you could say and make it in American society. Those limits have been lifted. And you can blame President Trump, you can blame the internet, you can blame Twitter, you can blame whoever you want, but they've been lifted. And once they're open, it's a Pandora's box. It's so hard to close it again. And we have seen that in this election. 2 other things about the data here that may be interesting, and then one comment about Israel and as it played out in this election. Latinos in the gender gap. I think you all know there's an enormous gender gap. Women vote more Democratic than men do, in general. I think it was 53 to 46 in this election went to Democratic votes, women as opposed to men. All right, in the African American community, the disparity was 6 percentage points, and that is 88% Democratic vote in the African American community with women, 82% with men. In the Latino community, it was 66% of women voted and 53% of men. An enormous fall-off of Latino men. We've heard a lot about the falling off of the Democratic vote amongst the Latino community. It hasn't been so much women, it has been with men. Here, but they actually did, the candidates in the border states outside of Florida, which is a disproportionate Cuban community, outside of Florida, they actually did better than had been predicted. In fact, if you look at the polling data, a lot of what was being reported was not what polls that were nonpartisan polls were saying. The nonpartisan polls, the network polls, the ABC, the New York Times, CBS, the Economist poll, several of the others, you know, they actually had it quite right. They were predicting something close to what happened in the country. Even Rasmussen, that generally does polling for Republicans, indicated there had been a pickup, a momentum was coming back to the Democrats in their last poll before the election. But that wasn't the impression that we had, and I indicated one of the factors, whether or not abortion or attacks on democracy were actual issues in the campaign. Here, as opposed when they weren't, then as I said, the crime, inflation, and immigration issues remain strong. It's interesting to note, by the way, that the majority of Latinos in America are no longer Catholic. They're evangelical. And that has been a significant change also in this way. But again, that doesn't mean that they're as conservative as the evangelicals we're talking about. Many African Americans are evangelical also, but it doesn't, they remain very liberal. So final insight about something that's good news for you if you're a Democrat, and good news for you if you're a Republican. If you're anything else, you won't be helped by this. Here, that is, how did youth vote? How did young people vote? in breaking it down more than usually most of the polls do 18 to 29, but breaking it down 18 to 24 and then 24 to 29, here, 61% of the 18 to 24-year-olds voted for Democrats. Now, interesting, if you go up one generation out of the Gen X to the millennial, 25 to 29, of the 25 to 29 age cohort, it went up from 61 to 65% voted Democratic. And of the 30 to 39, 64%, pretty consistent, 61, 65, 64. And immediately in the next cohort, it flips. Exactly those numbers, but in opposite. You have like 43%, 44%, 45% voting Democratic in the next three cohorts, getting up into the people in their 70s. They're in somewhere in the mid-50s or a little bit higher voting for Republicans. Interesting how it breaks down. But here is something that I haven't seen really noted by anyone yet, but I just found fascinating. 12% of the voters this year time were new voters. 12%. And one would have thought they would have voted Democratic, but they didn't. They actually voted 53% to 46% for Republicans. So good news for Republicans as well. So in the overview, now what does all of this mean for Israel? Israel went through an election. Right-wing parties were elected. There's real concern this will create growing alienation, both from American Jews and from the progressive Democrats in the party. The Progressive Caucus, which is 100 strong, is generally been pro-Israel, although the Squad, as you know, has been outspokenly critical of Israel. That's 6 members now. We have, as I said, Maxwell Frost, who's been elected, and Greg Caesar from Texas, and Summer Lee and Ramirez. Everyone's looking, they're very progressive, and they're looking to see where they're going to be on the Israel issue. No one knows exactly. A couple of them have strong ties to the Jewish community, but no one knows quite where they're going to end up. David Cicilline has replaced Ted Deutsch. Ted Deutsch was regarded as the strongest pro-Israel figure in the House of Representatives. He left the Congress to take over the American Jewish Committee, a great move for the committee, great move for Ted, who was a very close friend. Here, his wife Jill was one of our legislative assistants at the Religious Action Center. So we go back to, when he was just post-college student. And he's been a star here. David Cicilline, one of the most progressive members of the Congress, who has taken over the House subcommittee dealing with Middle East affairs. It'll be interesting to see. It's generally pro-Israel, but what happens if policies of restricting the authority of the Israeli Supreme Court, making it impossible to go ahead with the prosecutions of Bibi Netanyahu and Aryeh Deri? What happens if there's a major expansion of settlements? What happens if they actually try and force some Palestinians out of the West Bank? Here, we don't know what the outcome is. That we're in new territory. But as Bret Stephens pointed out, don't start talking about fascism in Israel. They make up somewhere between the right-wing parties 9 to 12% of the vote in Israel, where, depending on how you count, up to 40% of the vote in France would have been considered far right. And nobody's saying France has become a fascist country. We have to wait and see exactly what the policies are going to be here. But it is an issue to be on the radar screen about. And I actually think that the Progressive Caucus will remain, I think you'll hear them more outspokenly critical of Israeli policy. But I think when push comes to shove, the aid package, which is primarily military aid, will go through. and our interests in fighting Iran, our CENTCOM interests CENTCOM is the area of the military that deals with the Middle East region as a whole, in implementing the Abraham Accords. I think that those things are going to remain exceedingly strong in terms of common interests that we have with Israel. So this will be an interesting couple of years to see what happens with Israeli policy and how it intersects with American policy. My mentor, Al Vorspan, used to be fond of saying, in conclusion, the difference between an optimist and a pessimist is that an optimist argues that this is the best of all possible worlds, and a pessimist agrees. Well, we Jews are the eternal optimists. I hope that it is clear to sensible voices in the Republican Party that going down the path of election denial, of embracing the far right, of resonance with racist messages and anti-Semitic messages of people that they are working with, is not going to the end make for a better Republican Party. I hope that the Democrats will recognize that many of the things that Republicans lifted up to say that Democrats just weren't being responsive of. And one can argue they were responsive, but they just didn't do good messaging about it. But one can also argue that they needed to do more. But the truth is, we need that bipartisanship more than ever. We're never going to deal with climate change without bipartisan support. We're never going to deal with stopping the continued proliferation of nuclear weapons and how to deal with an ascendant China and an increasingly frustrated Russia with the capabilities it has to wreak havoc, unless we're going to work together, Republicans and Democrats alike, on the international scene. And at a time that we have seen a retrenchment of human rights and democracy across the globe and the attendant growth of authoritarianism, we're not going to protect democracy at home or abroad unless we're willing together to do it together. Aniviata Nishanet Aulam, our song goes, you and I together, we can change the world. I hope all Americans can find a way to say that to each other. You and I together, we can, we must, we will change the world. Thank you. Rabbi?
Thank you, Rabbi. I know that I have so many questions for you that have been spurred by your speech. I'm going to ask that if you have